You left because you finally chose peace over confusion, and that quiet decision did something his ego was never prepared for. Most people assume that leaving someone quietly must be some kind of strategy. They imagine it as a calculated move, a way to trigger regret, jealousy, or panic. But in reality, the most powerful kind of leaving rarely begins with a desire to hurt the other person. It begins with a moment of emotional honesty with yourself. You reach a point where you can no longer explain away the same disappointment, the same half-effort, the same emotional inconsistency. You stop trying to reshape the situation into something it has never been willing to become. And that is exactly why this kind of departure is not about punishment. It is about self-respect. When you leave because you finally choose emotional self-respect over emotional chaos, something very different is happening inside you. You are no longer asking, "How do I make him see my value?" You are asking, "Why am I still placing my value in a situation that keeps making me doubt it?" That shift is subtle, but it is profound. It moves you from proving yourself to protecting yourself. It moves you from managing his behavior to managing your emotional well-being. And that is the moment you stop negotiating with your own boundaries. Emotional chaos often disguises itself as hope. You tell yourself that if you communicate better, wait a little longer, stay a little softer, or become a little more understanding, things will finally stabilize. But what actually happens is that your nervous system stays in a constant state of uncertainty. You are alert all the time. You are overanalyzing tone, timing, and distance. You are reading into silence and trying to decode small gestures for reassurance. Over time, this doesn't just exhaust you, it slowly teaches you to accept less than you truly need, simply to avoid another emotional drop. Choosing self-respect is the moment you recognize that love should not require you to live in emotional survival mode. It should not demand that you become smaller, quieter about your needs, or more tolerant of confusion just to keep someone close. Self-respect asks a different question. It asks whether the connection supports your emotional health or slowly erodes it. It asks whether you feel safe to be fully yourself, or whether you are constantly adapting your behavior to avoid triggering withdrawal, defensiveness, or indifference. This is why quiet leaving is not dramatic. It does not come from anger. It comes from emotional clarity. You stop needing the other person to agree with your decision. You stop needing them to finally understand what they failed to give you. You realize that waiting for someone to validate your pain keeps you emotionally tied to the very dynamic that is hurting you. And so you release the need to convince, you release the need to prove, you release the need for a perfectly worded goodbye that will suddenly make everything make sense. What changes most is your relationship with discomfort. Before, you were willing to tolerate emotional instability because the fear of losing the connection felt bigger than the cost of staying. Now, the cost of staying finally becomes clearer than the fear of leaving. You can feel the weight of what you have been carrying. The constant emotional monitoring, the internal bargaining, the hope that keeps resetting after every letdown. And you begin to see that staying is not loyalty, it is self-abandonment. Leaving quietly is often an act of compassion toward yourself. You are no longer trying to extract closure from someone who may never be emotionally available enough to give it. You are no longer demanding that the relationship become something it has consistently shown you it cannot sustain. You accept reality instead of negotiating with it, and acceptance, although painful at first, is far more stabilizing than false hope. This is also why your departure does not need to be justified. When you choose emotional self-respect, you understand that you do not owe anyone access to your time, your energy, or your emotional labor simply because you once cared. Caring does not obligate you to remain in a situation that keeps diminishing you. Love without emotional safety becomes a slow erosion of self-trust. The quiet power of this decision is that it restores your inner authority. You stop waiting for permission to choose what feels aligned. You stop asking whether your needs are reasonable. You begin trusting your emotional signals instead of overriding them. And in doing so, you send the most important message, not to him, but to yourself. Your peace is not something you have to earn by enduring confusion. It is something you protect by choosing yourself, even when that choice means walking away. When you leave and choose silence, it is often misunderstood as emotional withdrawal or a way of trying to appear strong. But in truth, your silence after leaving is not about creating mystery. It is about finally seeing clearly. Clarity is what happens when you stop reacting to every emotional trigger and start observing the pattern instead. You no longer interpret each moment in isolation. You recognize the cycle, the apologies that reset nothing, the brief warmth that disappears the moment you relax, the repeated promises that never quite turn into consistent behavior. And once you truly see that pattern, you cannot unsee it. This is why silence becomes natural rather than forced. You are no longer emotionally pulled into the same conversations that used to drain you. You do not feel the same urgency to explain how you feel for the 10th time, hoping that maybe this version of your words will finally land. You understand that being understood by the wrong person is not a communication problem, it is a capacity problem. And clarity teaches you the difference. For someone whose sense of power comes from emotional influence, this shift is deeply unsettling. When you were confused, you were emotionally available. You were open to being persuaded, reassured, delayed, and softened. Confusion keeps you engaged. It keeps you asking questions. It keeps you negotiating your own standards. But clarity closes those open loops. It quietly removes you from the emotional chessboard where every move used to pull you back in. This is why clarity feels threatening to an insecure ego, not because you are trying to dominate, but because you are no longer emotionally dependent on their reactions. You stop measuring your worth through their attention. You stop adjusting your behavior to protect their comfort at the expense of your own stability. And when someone is used to being the emotional reference point in a connection, losing that position feels like losing control. Your silence is not coldness. It is emotional boundaries finally being enforced instead of explained. Before, your boundaries were often followed by long justifications, emotional overgiving, and second chances that you had not truly healed from. Now, your boundary is simply distance, not because you hate them, but because you respect yourself enough to protect your nervous system from returning to a dynamic that kept you emotionally dysregulated. There is a profound shift that happens when you stop needing to be validated in order to move on. You realize that waiting for someone to acknowledge your pain can keep you emotionally tethered far longer than the relationship itself deserves. Silence becomes a way of ending the internal conversation, not just the external one. It allows your emotional energy to come back to you instead of constantly being directed towards someone who is no longer part of your future. Clarity also removes the fantasy version of the relationship. You no longer focus on who they could be if circumstances were different, or if they finally did the inner work you hoped they would do. You focus on who they consistently were with you. This shift is sobering, but it is stabilizing. It grounds you in reality instead of emotional potential. And reality is far easier to heal from than possibility. For an ego that feeds on emotional relevance, your calm disengagement can feel like invisibility. Not being chased, confronted, or emotionally processed can feel far more uncomfortable than being criticized. When you stop reacting, you stop offering emotional feedback, and emotional feedback is what confirms influence. Silence removes that mirror. It no longer reflects their importance in your inner world. What makes this particularly powerful is that your clarity is not loud. You do not announce it. You do not post about it. You do not perform indifference. You simply move forward with a steadiness that no longer needs commentary. Your life begins to organize itself around what supports your peace rather than around what might repair the past. That quiet consistency becomes its own statement, and perhaps the most transformative part is that clarity repairs your relationship with yourself. You begin to trust your perception again. You stop doubting whether you were overreacting or asking for too much. You stop rewriting your emotional reality to fit someone else's limitations. In that space, your self-trust strengthens. And once you trust yourself, you no longer need to keep explaining your silence. You understand it. And that understanding is what makes it so difficult for anyone who once relied on your confusion to reach you again. When you stop explaining yourself, justifying your needs, and chasing closure, something very quiet but very powerful shifts inside you. For a long time, your emotional energy may have been invested in trying to make yourself understood. You carefully chose your words, softened your tone, and replayed conversations in your head, hoping that if you expressed your feelings clearly enough, the other person would finally meet you where you were. But what you slowly begin to realize is that understanding was never the real issue. Availability was. Explaining yourself becomes exhausting when you are repeatedly speaking to someone who hears you, but does not truly receive you. You start to notice that your emotional openness is met with temporary concern instead of lasting change. You are listened to but not adjusted for, you are acknowledged but not prioritized, and over time you learn a painful lesson: communication cannot substitute for emotional investment. No matter how clearly you articulate your needs, they cannot create capacity in someone who is not ready to offer it. Justifying your needs often comes from a subtle fear that asking for emotional consistency, effort, or respect might make you seem demanding. So you begin to package your needs in smaller, more acceptable forms. You explain why you feel the way you do. You offer context, you minimize your disappointment, you reassure them that you are not asking for too much. But every time you defend your emotional boundaries, you unconsciously teach yourself that your needs must be negotiated in order to be legitimate. Chasing closure is often the final attempt to regain emotional balance after things have already become unstable. You want a clear ending, you want acknowledgement, you want some form of emotional recognition that what you experienced mattered. But closure, when it depends on another person, can become an emotional trap. You return to conversations that reopen wounds. You revisit details that keep you anchored to the past, and you wait for a response that may never arrive in the way you need it to. When you stop doing all three, explaining, justifying, and chasing, you are not giving up. You are reclaiming your emotional authority. You are quietly accepting that your inner experience does not require external approval in order to be valid. You stop trying to convince someone of your worth, your pain, or your perspective. You allow your understanding of what happened to be enough. This is the moment when you remove the emotional supply that someone's ego may have relied on. Emotional supply is not always admiration. Very often, it is attention, emotional availability, and the reassurance that you are still emotionally invested. Every message, every attempt to clarify, every request for closure signals that they still hold an important place in your emotional world. It confirms relevance, it confirms influence, it confirms that your emotional energy is still oriented toward them. When you stop offering that energy, the dynamic changes. There is no longer a steady stream of emotional engagement to regulate their sense of importance. Your silence is not meant to punish. It simply reflects a reorganization of your emotional priorities. Your focus returns to your healing, your stability, and your future, And when someone is used to being emotionally central in your life, losing that position can feel disorienting. What makes this shift especially powerful is that it does not rely on anger or emotional shutdown. It is rooted in self-protection. You begin to recognize that reopening emotional conversations that lead nowhere is a form of self-betrayal. You see that repeatedly justifying your needs trains you to accept less than you deserve, and you understand that chasing closure can delay your ability to move forward. Instead, you create your own emotional closure by naming the reality of the relationship for yourself. You acknowledge what you gave, you acknowledge what was missing, you acknowledge how you felt, and you let that truth stand without needing it to be confirmed by the other person. This is not denial, it is emotional maturity. As your emotional attention withdraws, something else grows in its place. Your capacity to self-regulate strengthens. You become less reactive. You are no longer waiting for messages, explanations, or emotional cues to decide how you feel. You begin responding to your life again, rather than to someone who is no longer actively participating in it. This is why the absence of explanation can feel louder than any argument. It signals that you are no longer emotionally available for a dynamic that depended on your willingness to keep trying. You are no longer supplying reassurance through your persistence. You are no longer offering emotional access without emotional reciprocity. In choosing to stop explaining yourself, justifying your needs, and chasing closure, you quietly move from emotional dependence to emotional self-leadership. And it is this shift, far more than any dramatic goodbye, that changes how power and attachment are experienced on both sides of the connection. There is a quiet contrast that becomes visible when someone walks away with calm emotional maturity. You are not reactive. You are not dramatic. You are not trying to win the breakup or control the narrative. You are simply grounded, and in that groundedness, something uncomfortable is revealed in the other person. Walking away calmly does not accuse, criticize, or demand. It reflects the emotional tone of the connection, the imbalance in effort, and the difference in emotional capacity. And that reflection can be deeply unsettling for someone who has not developed the same level of inner stability. Emotional maturity is not about being unbothered. It is about being regulated. It is about noticing your feelings without letting them run your behavior. It is about allowing disappointment, sadness, and grief to exist without turning them into emotional chaos. When you leave calmly, you show that you can hold your emotions without needing someone else to fix, validate, or absorb them for you. That ability quietly exposes how much of the relationship may have been driven by emotional reactivity rather than emotional responsibility. For someone who struggles with emotional insecurity, this contrast can feel like a spotlight. Emotional insecurity is often hidden behind defensiveness, avoidance, control, or emotional unpredictability. It is not always obvious, but when you stop participating in the same emotional patterns, the difference becomes clearer. Your steadiness highlights their volatility, your clarity highlights their indecision, your emotional boundaries highlight their discomfort with accountability. This is why insecure egos tend to react most strongly to quiet strength. Loud conflict gives them something to push against. It gives them a role, it allows them to frame the situation as mutual chaos, but calm withdrawal removes that stage. There is no emotional performance to respond to. There is only your composed exit and the emotional space it leaves behind. When someone's sense of worth is fragile, it often depends on comparison and control. They feel secure when they are needed, when they are being chased, when they are the emotional reference point in the dynamic. But when you walk away without bitterness, you quietly dismantle that structure. You show that your emotional stability is not dependent on their behavior. You show that you can survive the loss of the connection without losing yourself. and that realization can be far more confronting than anger. Emotional maturity also involves accepting reality without needing to reshape it to feel safer. You do not need to argue about who was right. You do not need to extract apologies that arrive too late to matter. You do not need to keep the door open to prove that you are kind. You accept what the relationship could and could not offer, and you let that be enough to guide your decision. This acceptance is powerful because it is grounded in self-trust. You trust your experience, you trust your emotional judgment, and you trust that walking away is not a failure, but a form of alignment. For someone who is emotionally insecure, this level of self-trust can feel threatening because it removes leverage. They cannot sway you as easily with mixed signals, temporary warmth, or emotional pullbacks. Your nervous system is no longer conditioned to chase relief through their approval. You are no longer trying to stabilize the relationship by destabilizing yourself. Instead, you stabilize yourself by stepping out of a dynamic that keeps you off balance. This is where the exposure happens, not through accusation, but through contrast. Your calm exit quietly communicates that emotional turbulence is no longer acceptable to you. It reveals that the relationship required more emotional labor from you than you were willing to continue giving. And without saying a word, it highlights how much of the connection depended on your flexibility rather than mutual emotional responsibility. Insecure egos often react loudly because the quietness leaves them alone with their own emotional patterns. There is no distraction, no argument to deflect into, no emotional exchange to soften the self-awareness that begins to rise. Your silence and steadiness remove the familiar dynamic that allowed emotional avoidance to continue. What makes this particularly meaningful is that your calm is not performative. It is not emotional suppression. It is the result of having processed your feelings before you acted. You grieved privately. You reflected honestly. You reached your decision internally before expressing it externally. So when you finally leave, you do not need to create emotional intensity to support the decision. The decision is already emotionally complete within you. Walking away calmly shows that you are no longer seeking emotional validation through reaction. You are choosing emotional integrity instead, and in doing so, you unintentionally reveal the difference between emotional security and emotional insecurity. You reveal that strength does not have to be loud to be unmistakable. When you walk away and step fully into your independence, the shift that occurs is subtle yet seismic. It is not the act of leaving itself that creates tension. It is the reality that you no longer need their presence to feel complete. For someone whose ego has been fed by your emotional attention, reassurance, or dependence, this revelation is profoundly destabilizing. What hurts less than your absence is the fact that your life continues to move forward without them. Your independence becomes proof that their perceived importance in your world was conditional, and now the conditions have quietly expired. Independence is not just about being alone. It is about reclaiming the part of yourself that you may have unknowingly outsourced to someone else. For a long time, you may have looked to their validation to confirm your worth, measured your decisions against their preferences, or even doubted your own instincts in favor of their approval. Independence reverses that dynamic. It is the act of trusting yourself enough to live your life fully without needing them to approve, respond, or reassure you at every step. And this is exactly what can unsettle an ego accustomed to being at the center of your emotional universe. The moment you stop relying on them emotionally, everything they once took for granted changes. They are no longer the measure of your happiness. They are no longer the gatekeeper of your attention. They are no longer the source of your identity or emotional stability. And for someone who thrived on the idea that your engagement and availability were guarantees, your quiet independence is disorienting. It is a demonstration that the power they assumed they had over your emotions was never truly theirs to wield. Independence also communicates boundaries without confrontation. You do not have to spell out your worth. You do not have to demand recognition for your effort. You do not have to explain why you deserve respect. By living fully and authentically without them, you silently enforce the standards that your presence had previously compromised. You demonstrate that emotional respect and energy are earned through consistency and care, not through assumption or entitlement. This lesson lands not through argument, but through your actions. For someone who relies on emotional leverage, your detachment signals that their strategies no longer function. Mixed signals, delayed responses, or manipulative behaviors that previously drew you back in are ineffective because your attention, energy, and presence are now allocated intentionally toward your own growth and stability. You are no longer a participant in a cycle of validation that reinforces their ego. Your calm, self-contained life removes the mirror they used to see their power reflected. Without your engagement, their inflated sense of control begins to diminish. Independence also strengthens your internal sense of self-worth. The longer you invest in being self-reliant emotionally, the less you depend on external approval to feel validated. Every decision you make for yourself, every boundary you uphold, every step forward that does not require their consent, reinforces your own authority over your life. This internal power is magnetic, but it is not attention-seeking. It is a quiet, grounded confidence that does not need acknowledgement to exist. And for someone who has built their ego on your attention, the very existence of that confidence without their input is profoundly unsettling. Your independence teaches the most important lesson, that emotional connections are not meant to define your value or dictate your life trajectory. You are free to care, free to love, free to invest in relationships, but not at the cost of your own stability or peace. And when you demonstrate that your life does not pause for someone else's inability to prioritize you, it subtly, yet unmistakably, shifts the dynamic. You show that emotional supply cannot be taken for granted, and that your energy is yours to give selectively. Walking away quietly while fully embracing your independence reveals the ultimate truth. You are not contingent on anyone's approval, affection, or attention to feel complete. That quiet demonstration of self-sufficiency can feel like a shock to someone whose ego assumed your dependency. It is the moment when they realize that they no longer hold the emotional leverage they thought they did, and that realization, more than anything else, can feel like the sharpest consequence of all. Your independence does not attack. It simply exists, and that existence alone dismantles assumptions, recalibrates expectations, and quietly asserts your unshakable value. The moment you leave without drama, without begging, without seeking revenge, you reclaim something far more powerful than any argument or confrontation could give you: control over your own life. For a long time, relationships, especially complicated or emotionally unbalanced ones, can feel like a negotiation between your desires and someone else's behavior. You may find yourself constantly adjusting, explaining, and justifying, trying to keep the connection alive, trying to manage the other person's reactions, or hoping they will finally meet you halfway. Walking away calmly interrupts that cycle completely. It is not about winning or proving a point. It is about choosing yourself in a way that is both quiet and undeniable. When you take back control of your time, energy, and emotional future, you are making a statement to yourself and to the other person. Your life is no longer dependent on their validation or their behavior. Every moment you spend trying to fix or chase someone else's ego is a moment that diminishes your own power. When you stop doing that, you stop being a participant in a dynamic that keeps you off balance. You regain the authority to decide how you spend your emotional energy, who you allow into your life, and under what conditions. That authority is inherently destabilizing to someone whose ego relied on the patterns you previously maintained. Regaining control is not about exerting dominance over them, it is about restoring alignment with yourself. For too long, you may have compromised your needs, overlooked red flags, or excused inconsistent behavior simply to preserve the connection or avoid conflict. In doing so, you surrendered parts of yourself without even realizing it. Walking away calmly is the process of reclaiming those parts, your dignity, your standards, your self-respect. By making the decision internally and acting without theatrics, you assert that your life moves according to your own principles, not theirs. The absence of drama in your eggs, it is what amplifies the impact. Drama, confrontation, and emotional spectacle can momentarily draw attention, but they rarely shift long-term dynamics. They may provoke anger or guilt, but they do not demonstrate self-possession. Quietly taking your power back, on the other hand, communicates something unmistakable. You are no longer entangled in a web of emotional manipulation or expectation. You are no longer available to be a tool for someone else's ego validation, and that realization is often more jarring than any argument could ever be. In this quiet reclamation of control, you also neutralize the need for revenge. Revenge presumes that someone has a power over you that they actually do not possess. When you seek revenge, you are giving them emotional leverage, letting their past actions dictate your current behavior. Walking away calmly rejects that logic entirely. You are not punishing them. You are simply redirecting your life in alignment with your own needs, values, and boundaries. This is the purest form of self-leadership, taking action not to affect them, but to protect and prioritize yourself. Control over your emotional future also means freedom from uncertainty. In unbalanced relationships, you often find yourself waiting for signals, hoping for explanations, or trying to predict reactions. That mental energy is exhausting because it is spent outside of yourself. When you walk away calmly, you remove that dependence. You no longer need their responses to regulate your feelings or decide your next steps. Instead, your sense of stability, confidence, and peace comes from within. You trust your judgment, your instincts, and your ability to navigate life independently. What makes this especially transformative is how it reframes power itself. Power is often misunderstood as manipulation, dominance, or aggression. True power, however, is rooted in self-possession. It is the ability to exist fully in your own life, regardless of how others behave. By taking back control of your time, energy, and emotional future, you demonstrate a type of power that is unshakable because it does not rely on external validation. It is the calm authority of someone who knows their value and will not compromise it for temporary comfort or chaos. Walking away without drama sends a message that resonates far beyond the immediate relationship. It tells you that you are capable of self-determination. It tells them that your presence is not automatic, that your engagement is intentional. It establishes a precedent for every future connection. You will participate fully, but only under terms that respect your dignity, peace, and emotional well-being. That act of quiet, self-directed control is not just a closure, it is a foundation. It is the moment when you reclaim ownership of your life, and that ownership is what the ego of anyone who once relied on your emotional energy cannot handle. Walking away quietly, calmly, and with self-respect is not about hurting him, it's about reclaiming your power, protecting your peace, and showing that your worth isn't defined by anyone else. In that quiet strength, you discover freedom, independence, and the unshakable confidence that no ego can ever diminish.